All right, so today's session is called The Path to Continuous Improvement, the Importance of Understanding Culture. And part of what this is, it's a webinar series we hope to get started, offered by the Master of Science in Management Operational Excellence here at St. Vincent. And I'll talk about some of the things we do in that program here in a couple of seconds. But before we get into that, I'm Dr. Mike Urich. I'm the Graduate Director of the program. Great to see some familiar names logging in to the webinar today. Nice to see some new names logging into the webinar as well. So hopefully everyone can take something from today's session and have some fun while we're learning about organizational culture and operational excellence. Okay. So let's talk about the Master of Science in Management. I have to do a little plug before we get into the content. So a note about the MSMOE program. We're a small program, small but mighty. We have about 30 to 40 students, depending on the semester. But with as small of a program, we've had some great notoriety. We've had a lot of great notoriety in the program. We've gotten 2 recent rankings, and one of those rankings is actually by U.S. News and World Report. So actually in January, in their most recent ranking, the Master of Science in Management Operational Excellence program got a ranking for best, one of the best, top 100 non-MBA online business graduate programs. So pretty impressive, and we're really proud of that ranking. Another one is the Value Colleges actually gives a ranking for best masters in management, and in their 2 most recent rankings, we placed on that as well. So very happy for those accolades. A couple of other things I have on this slide. I know it's a little bit busy, but I think it represents what the program's about pretty well. We had a student, actually Alpern Arslantis, presented with me. He had some research that he developed as a part of being in the graduate program here at St. Vincent. And we presented that research at the Academy of Management Conference last year. The conference was held in Atlanta, Georgia. And he presented that with me last year, did a fantastic job. It's one of the top conferences in the field. So really great to have some of our students participating in research on that level. We've also been published, actually Alpern's piece was also published in the Journal of Gerontology and Geriatric Study. We've had publications, student-led publications, published by the Association for the Healthcare Environment, as well as the Journal of Leadership and Management. We just had a very recent publication that came out actually just earlier this month, and it's called Social Barriers to Implementing Continuous Improvement Initiatives. And this was published in the Journal of Management for Global Sustainability. And really proud of this piece. In fact, a lot of what we'll talk about today is reflected in this piece. And this was published, I worked on this with Dr. Terrence Smith. He's our director of the Kennemental Center for Operational Excellence, but also with Muyang Lee. He's a recent graduate of the MSMOE program, as well as Celine Koner, who is a current MSMOE student. So we're really happy about this piece. And I'd be happy, by the way, to send this on to anybody viewing this. If you'd like to read this, I'd be happy to do that. I also have this as well. For folks that want a little bit of a flavor of what the MSMOE program is about, that article is included in here. This is just some readings that we compiled related to the philosophy of the MSMOE program. And it's some areas of research, some bits of research that some students and professors in the program have put out, and we'd be happy to share this with you. I have electronic copies, I have hard copies, so I can either send this via email or snail mail to you as well. Just give me an email and let me know if you'd like that. We don't just do research, this is a very practical degree as well. So a couple of pictures here show some things that we've been doing. Getting out there in the field, seeing how some of these concepts are being used real time. We do an OE around the world trip. Both our undergraduate OE students and our graduate OE students are welcome to the trip. And so this is a picture here of a facility we visited, I think it was about 5 or 6 years ago in Germany. Touring their facilities. We toured several facilities that year and every year. We've gone to Germany, Austria, Ireland, Spain, Czech Republic, China, a variety of other countries as well on that trip to tour some facilities to see how some of the things we talk about in the program are used in practice. We've also toured PPG locally. We're aligned with the Institute for Supply Management Pittsburgh affiliate, and we often take students to those dinner meetings in Pittsburgh. We've had presentations at the Society for Advancement of Management Conference, and also we've toured the Toyota facility in Georgetown, Kentucky as well. One of the things that we do in the program, that we make sure that we stay relevant, that the concepts that we're talking about relate to what's going on in the real world. We've partnered with several organizations that help us to both as a sounding board, in essence. We share with them what we're teaching in the program, and they say, yeah, this is a value. Sometimes they say, you know what, it would be great if you added this in as well. And so our business partners include Norma. Locally, they're based out of Salzburg, but obviously they're worldwide. Kennametal, similarly based out of Latrobe locally, but worldwide organization as well. Excella Health, Hamill Manufacturing, and the Institute for Supply Management Pittsburgh affiliate. We also do a partnership with the University of Kentucky, their True Lean Center in their engineering college. And there we go through a hands-on certification where students actually get certified in the sort of the Toyota methodology of continuous improvement. And it relates very closely with what we do in the program. So that's a lot about what we do in the program. That's sort of a plug before we get into the actual content of today. So let's jump right into what we're going to talk about today. Here's our agenda. We're going to do a couple of things. First, we're going to talk about what is organizational culture, sort of generally. You know, talk about what that entails, what that term means. Then we're going to talk about why we need to examine organizational culture in an operational excellence program, or if we're trying to implement operational excellence in our organizations, why organizational culture is so important, so crucial. So we'll talk about why OE is concerned with culture. And then we're going to break down typical OE cultures. Okay, we're going to break down typical OE cultures by looking at some assumptions of some typical OE cultures, some values of some typical OE cultures, and some artifacts of some typical OE cultures. And we'll explain those terms in a couple of seconds so you kind of get a sense for what we mean by assumptions, values, and artifacts. Then we're going to give you some example basic OE tools. Tools are a type of artifact. And so we'll talk about some artifacts of OE cultures. Then at the end, we're going to talk about changing culture. Okay, the issue here is, I hear a lot of folks say to me, well, I work for this organization and we'd like to implement continuous improvement initiatives, but they fail all the time. And the reason is because sometimes organizations start with the tools and not the underlying assumptions or values of the culture. Okay. And so when we want to change from a culture perhaps not focused as much on continuous improvement to one that is focused on continuous improvement, we need to really start, or at least we need to consider the assumptions and the values level as well, not just the tools. So we'll talk about how we change a culture as well. Okay, we'll talk about changing a culture. And hopefully we'll have some time at the end for some questions and discussions as well for those logging in. So let's jump right in. 3 levels of culture. And I like to think of levels of culture kind of like an iceberg. Okay, very much like an iceberg. So at the tip of the iceberg, we see artifacts. Okay? In an organizational culture, artifacts are those things that we experience with the senses. So these are the things we see when we walk into an organization. These are the things we hear when we walk into an organization. Okay? The things we experience with the senses, pretty visible, physical manifestations of a culture. But below that, sort of below the surface, we have values and assumptions. So values are ideals or aspirations. These things are what the organization cares about. Okay, so when we think about what an organization cares about, those are the values. That's the value side of the culture. Then below the values are assumptions. These are unconscious, taken for granted ideas or concerns. These things aren't really often discussed regularly. These are values that have become so embedded, so understood, that in the organization, we no longer need to talk about them anymore. It's just sort of our common mentality. It's our common way of thinking. And because we all think the same way in a culture, these are things we just don't discuss. These are things that are sort of unquestioned. And by the way, because they're unquestioned, because they're oftentimes unarticulated, they're very difficult to sort of pinpoint. You know, I think when we think of values, we can probably say, okay, here are some, 9 or 10 things that an organization cares about. Maybe they're listed on an organization's website. Maybe they're included in an organization's value statement. When we think about physical manifestations of culture, the artifacts, yeah, we can walk into any facility in any organization and see the physical layout. We can see those things that make up the workplace. We can see even things like what's hanging on the walls, perhaps, artwork, posters, etc. But those assumptions are more difficult to sort of pinpoint, very difficult to articulate. But the important thing is this: they build, okay? So those assumptions that are taken for granted, they're unarticulated, they're sort of in our subconscious as an organizational whole. On top of those, freeze the values, freeze those things that we care about. But on top of those values, freeze the artifacts. So in other words, artifacts are just representations of this deeper stuff. And so to use an analogy here, I always like to talk about the Titanic. You think about the Titanic, and you're the captain on the Titanic, and you're thinking, okay, I'm sailing in the water, and I see this little piece of ice floating on the top of the water. Well, I can push that pretty easily. I'm this huge ship. I'm this huge boat. I can just nudge that and push it very gently, no problem. But what you forget is that there's a lot beneath the surface. And this is actually what a lot of organizations do, is they try and implement operational excellence. Okay, you know what? I want to change a process. I want to put in a suggestion box so employees can continuously improve the piece of a process that perhaps they're working on. And so we're going to put that, we're going to change an artifact there. Okay, that's an artifact. And we think we can maybe just push that artifact, change the artifact. But just like the Titanic, it's not the tip of the surface that gave us a problem, it's what's beneath that. Okay, so we actually crash into the totality of the iceberg. We crash into the values, the assumptions. So as we try and implement operational excellence, we can try and implement all the tools we want up here, but what's going to give us problems are these things down here. And so that's what's not going to work for us, and that's what's going to cause us the greatest failure. Okay, so hopefully this is making sense to everybody so far. Let's talk a little bit more about an example of this, because I think it's a little bit clearer when we think about an example of culture to see these three levels. St. Vincent College is the organization that I work for. So, and it's one perhaps you're logging in to this webinar, you're viewing this webinar, and so maybe it's an organization that you're familiar with as well. So since we're all kind of familiar with St. Vincent to an extent, let's use this as an example to illustrate those three levels of culture. I think the easiest to see are obviously the artifact level, the physical manifestations of culture. The one thing you see driving up to St. Vincent College, if you're driving, down 30 near Latrobe, one of the first things you're going to see off of Route 30 is the Basilica. It's very prominent. Very prominent. On campus, it's very prominent. It's beautiful. You can see it from all over the area as you're driving by Latrobe. You can see it from many points on campus as well. It's a very prominent building. Very prominent building. Similarly, you're walking around on campus. Here's a picture of our newly redone science buildings, our School of Science. You see a lot of tradition there. You see how some old structures were incorporated into that new facility. But you also see a lot of work being done to show the innovativeness of that building as well. To kind of add on to what we already have, to improve upon what we already have as well. Here I have a logo. We're about ready to start the training camp this year, the Steelers training camp. Of course, we all know that St. Vincent is the summer home of the Pittsburgh Steelers. And that's part of what you see on campus. I read a couple of recent press releases about how the Steelers are gearing up to come back to Latrobe, to come on campus. In 2015, we celebrated our 50th year of Steelers training camp here. And so that's a lot of what you hear about, a lot of what you see on campus. I was just at the St. Vincent bookstore today, and alongside St. Vincent hats and shirts, they were selling Steelers hats and shirts as well. Then, of course, here's a picture of in the classroom. You can see the professor here. Students gathered around the professor. Very conversational in nature, very much like a dialogue. And these are things that I notice whenever I walk around St. Vincent. Okay? Whenever I experience St. Vincent, these are sort of the artifacts that I see, the physical manifestations of the culture. The way we instruct, the structures, the things we talk about, but they're all related to the values of our organization as well. Openness is one value that we have here. Openness in terms of thought. There are a lot of different programs here on campus. We like to approach I'd like to think a dialogue when we're engaging in classes. So that if this were a class session, it wouldn't necessarily be me lecturing and talking the whole time. It would very much be a dialogue between everybody logging in and everybody sitting in the classroom. And we do that quite a bit here, especially in grad classes, I think, like the MSMOE program, but in other classes as well. Faith is another big one. Obviously, St. Vincent is a Benedictine Catholic institution. And so while you see openness in the way we structure our classes and the types of things we talk about in classes, you see faith in some of the structures that we have here on campus. That's a physical manifestation of that value, what we care about. We also care about community. I mentioned before about the Steelers training camp. Well, one of the things that does, it helps St. Vincent become part of the local community. People come from all over the place to come to training camp. It's almost like a summer tradition. We're part of the community. It's community building in essence. Hospitality is a big thing we talk about here at St. Vincent as well. Welcomeness. When people come on campus to the St. Vincent training camp, we're welcoming them onto campus. We're inviting them to come and hang out here for a couple of hours or a day or so. We also care about tradition. Tradition is important to us. So the idea of tradition, we have, if you walk through campus, we see buildings that have been on campus for quite some time. We've added to them, we've built them up, but we respect the tradition as well. If you walk outside the Basilica, you see a statue of our founder there. That's respect for tradition. We also care about understanding. We're a liberal arts institution, so we want a holistic understanding of phenomena that we see around us. And we see that through the education that we provide. So what I'm suggesting to you is this, and by the way, we can go on and on and on listing values and artifacts of St. Vincent's culture. These are some that I note, but what I'm suggesting is that all of these values are related to all these artifacts. Each one of these values we can see as driving one of these artifacts, or multiple of these artifacts. Now, where do these values come from? I mentioned before that a lot of times what we see is the assumptions of a culture being unarticulated. And so when we're talking about values, we don't always perhaps have some statement that drives those values. But here at St. Vincent, actually, we have the rule of St. Benedict. A lot of what we're talking about here with the values are related to what's been written in the rule of St. Benedict. Very instrumental document, very instrumental piece, guiding our assumptions, guiding our values, guiding the artifacts that we see here at St. Vincent. So we see, in essence, that linkage here between assumptions, between values, between artifacts. And so hopefully that clarifies those three levels of culture a little bit. Now, let's talk about the importance of culture. So when we think about culture, we have a lot of overlaps here. So overlapping categories of culture that actually inform each other. So we have macro culture, like our nation, our region, maybe religious culture, the religion that we belong to, maybe the culture of the industry or the occupation that we work in. We also have organizational culture, like our workplace. But we also have subcultures and microcultures within our workplaces, departments, work groups, even social groups within our workplaces. So if we want to define formally what an organizational culture is an informal system of control. Now that kind of sounds, it's not meant to sound devious in nature. Because what we're really trying to control here is we want to try and control behavior of the people that come to work. You know, in an organization, we don't necessarily want a free-for-all. We want to expect or have some expectation of what people will do when they come on the job. And so the culture signals, in essence, those expectations. What is right, what is wrong in that context? What is a social norm that we don't want to break in that context? And what are behaviors that we want to engage in that context? And those assumptions, values, and artifacts help reinforce those things. So in essence, it's a social order. It's a system of shared understanding. So you might hear a culture described as the way things are done around here. That's kind of getting to that assumptions level. It's just, kind of common knowledge. It's just the way we do things. It's who we are. So it's a force that, in essence, normalizes appropriate behavior. But what it does, it stabilizes organizations for predictability. A strong culture, you kind of know what to expect. Now, there are good things and bad things about strong cultures. And we're not necessarily going to get into that so much today as we would in some of the other classes in the program. This is just, after all, a shortened version of some of what we'll be talking about throughout the other classes in the MSMOE program. But a culture influences an organization's image. In other words, what people see from the outside. And so when we talk about a strong culture, having a positive culture, if we have a positive, strong culture that people can relate to, we might become an employer of choice, meaning that people want to work for us. People will actively seek us out as a potential employer. It's kind of related to the attraction, selection, attrition framework. We attract people that believe they will fit in with a particular value or assumption of a culture. So in other words, they'll apply for the job. Then, as an organization, we'll hire those people that we view fit in this culture. Attrition is that last step where if someone doesn't necessarily fit the values or the assumptions of that culture, maybe performance drops and so they're asked to leave, or they feel unwelcome there and so they leave on their own. But what happens is then this over time reinforces and strengthens a culture. It reinforces and strengthens a culture. Again, good things and bad things related to that, which we can talk about in the Q&A, or we talk a lot more about in the organizational course in the MSMOE program. But bottom line, when we think about culture, it has an influence on organizational processes. A process is an artifact. It's a manifestation of what we care about, of our values in essence. It's a way we do things here. And so when we think about culture as something that stabilizes an organization for predictability, in an OE environment, we're looking for predictability. We're trying to minimize variability. That's why cultures are so important to examine with regard to operational excellence. Now, the challenging thing here is this. We're all part of a variety of different cultures. So when we think about culture, we're all somewhere here. And we need to understand the norms of the culture, perhaps, that we're in to be effective in that particular culture. To understand the norms of that particular culture so that we can be effective in that role, So if we think about our organization's culture, what can we do? What are appropriate behaviors within that context? And how do we know those from some overlapping cultures, perhaps, that we're a part of as well? I like to think of a culture as kind of like a fishbowl. I have a picture of a fishbowl here. And to me, this is the easiest or the simplest analogy to understand what a culture is. You know, it's kind of like, I can think about times when I might have changed jobs, okay? And I'm like a fish. So consider you're that goldfish. You were just won at a carnival. And so you're in that clear plastic bag, you're going into that winner's house that just won you at the carnival, and they're walking you closer and closer towards a fishbowl. Okay, so the employee, using this analogy, is the fish. And that fishbowl is the new organization. So as the fish, you're looking at this fishbowl and you say to yourself, oh, I've been in a fishbowl before. I've been swimming my entire life. And I know what that fishbowl is going to be like. I know what it's going to be like in that culture. Like an employee, you might have been doing a particular job all your career. And so you think you know what it's going to be like in that new job, in that new role. But what happens is this. You get dumped into that new fishbowl, and it's like, oh, the water's a lot colder or warmer than I expected. The decorations are different. Here, there's a treasure chest where there used to be a castle in my old fishbowl. The artifacts are different, the values are different, and the assumptions are different. And so that makes it a little bit challenging to do your job in that brand new culture because you're not aware of those things yet. Now, what happens over time? Once you've been swimming in water over time, you kind of get used to that water. You kind of get used to that environment. Kind of like in an organization, once you've been working in a culture for so long, you get used to that culture. It becomes second nature, almost unquestioned. And that's what kind of happens in an organization as well. It becomes almost unquestioned once you've been swimming in it for a while. So that those assumptions become unquestioned, unarticulated perhaps, and just second nature. You forget you're swimming in the water. You forget you're part of that fishbowl. You forget you're part of that culture. It's so second nature. Okay, now let's transition a little bit and talk about the relevance that this has to operational excellence. Some folks that are watching this might say, well, what is operational excellence? Let's talk about what operational excellence is. First of all, there's a lot of different definitions of OE. But the definition that we often work with here at St. Vincent in our program is that it's a management philosophy. So it's a management philosophy really focused on people, on organizations, and processes. We say that to be an effective manager leader, you need to understand your people, the people that you work with, that work for you, that you work for, and also your customers. You need to have a solid understanding of all of those groups. But you also need to know your organization. What are our organization's goals? And your organization doesn't have to be, by the way, like a huge corporation. It could be a small startup, a nonprofit. It could be a small team within an organization. But you need to understand that social group's goals, in essence, to be effective as a manager or a leader. You also need to understand processes. How do we do things here? What are our ways of working? And so an effective manager, an effective leader will understand these three things. Sometimes whenever I'm talking with organizations about OE, I hear that some people say, well, that's just, OE is really just related to industry, or related to manufacturing rather. Actually, I can't think of really any industry that operational excellence can't help benefit. So the benefits to any industry, I think, are vast. In fact, in the program, we have many people from a variety of industries, not just manufacturing, healthcare, IT, human resources, and I could go on and on with others as well. Because the idea of operational excellence is, while keeping in mind people, organizations, and processes, we also want to make sure we're continuously improving, we're eliminating waste, and we're problem solving. So continuous improvement, waste elimination, and problem solving are three things that I see any organization finding use for. But there's that stigma of OE. It's not applicable here. And some of that comes from organizations that have tried to implement Lean or OE or other continuous improvement initiatives and have failed. Because it's challenging to change from a non-OE oriented culture to a culture that is oriented in OE. It's challenging to do that. Challenging to do that. The reason why is because when many people try and change, when many organizations try and change from a non-OE culture to an OE culture, they start here at the artifacts. They start at the artifacts, those physical representations, the manifestations of culture. But it's not the best way, especially if you're only looking at the artifacts, because what happens is you take away an artifact. The same or similar artifact is going to eventually refreeze on top of the assumptions and the values of the organization. It's going to eventually refreeze on top of it. So if we don't change the assumptions, the values, our common way of thinking and what we care about, then the physical manifestations, the representation of that culture also won't change. Our process won't change. We won't be able to implement OE tools. So let's talk about these three areas specifically as they relate to OE cultures. And by the way, I should also mention that every culture, every organizational culture is a little bit different, but we might see some commonalities or trends that exist for operational excellence cultures, or those that are striving to be more OE oriented. The first is respect for people. That's the first assumption. A true OE culture needs to respect its people. If it doesn't, it's not going to work. If you truly don't have respect for people in your organization, you cannot be an OE culture. Well, why is that? Let's think about a couple of things. Respect for people means respect for our customers, respect for our employees, respect for the world at large. So that means a couple of things. First, we need to be sustainably oriented, okay? That's part of waste reduction. So part of waste reduction is that sustainability component as well. If we care about people, we'll have that orientation in mind. But not only that, part of OE is about a focus on a customer. We want to provide the quality of a product or service that our customer demands. And so if we're not focused on what they want, if we're not focused on people, we can't do that. But even more so is this big one. Some employees tend to be afraid of continuous improvement, or OE, or lean. And the reason is this. Because if you improve a process, and you continue to improve a process over and over and over and over, and it gets more and more efficient, what does that mean? Well, ultimately, that means that someone could be out of a job. And while OE works best perhaps when we're in growth mode, so we can move that person into another job, we need to have some assurance from that person that there will be a place for you. We're going to move on to try something new. We're going to develop a new product. We're going to launch a new initiative. So yeah, while your role might change, you have a place here in this organization. And so one of the things that Toyota says they do is they say there's no layoffs here. Because the second that people think that if I continuously improve, if I make this process more efficient, and they're afraid of losing their job because of it, guess what? They're not going to embrace operational excellence. They're not going to improve. So we need that respect for people side. We need that respect for people side to offer that long-term employment of employees that we expect to continuously improve. Continuous improvement, we've been talking about this a lot already, but continuous improvement is another assumption. Okay, so if we're thinking about OE, fundamentally we're talking about always doing better. Always doing better, always improving quality, always improving efficiency, always using less, waste reduction, always finding more effective ways to solve problems. And those are the two major assumptions of an OE culture. Well, these two assumptions, just like we talked about with the St. Vincent example of how the assumptions in the rule of St. Benedict kind of drove the values of our culture, well, we have values of OE cultures as well. I talked about some already. The first two that I have listed there is providing value to customers. That's one. And so we talked about that idea of providing value to customers as deriving from that respect for people assumption. No layoffs, that's the second one. We talked about that as being derived again from the respect for people. But now kind of going along with that continuous improvement assumption, the idea of flexible stability. To continuously improve, we need to do a couple of things. We want to reduce variation, so that means standardization is a value. We want standardization because standardization means we can measure a process. We can measure parts of a process. And only if we can measure a part of a process can we actually improve on it. So we want to try and reduce variation. But this is continuous improvement. We want to document things. Absolutely. When we have a part of a process that changed, we want to document how it changed. We want to have those steps to do a particular job written down. But once a new way is found to do it, these things aren't written in stone. Those standards can change. Those standards should be written by our employees and rewritten by them, improved upon them, changed by them as they continue to innovate, as they continue to improve the process. So along with that is the idea of 6S, things you've probably heard about already: sort, straighten, scrub, systematize, standardize, safety, and sustain. That's the values of all those things are kind of derived from continuous improvement, because we really won't be able to achieve continuous improvement without those things. But waste minimization is also a value coming from that idea of continuous improvement. What are we trying to minimize? Well, we want to try and minimize movement of materials, also worker motion as well. So we're not taxing our employees. We want to minimize waiting. We see time as a waste. We want to minimize waiting. We want to minimize overproduction, making perhaps more than what we need to make. We want to minimize defects. We want to minimize errors. We want to minimize inventory. We don't want to see a lot of extra products laying around, or components of products laying around. I already talked about worker motion. We want to minimize extra processing, things that aren't value. In other words, with waste minimization, we're getting rid of those things that aren't valuable to our customers, and we're trying to streamline. We also value visual management, because the idea is, if we assume that continuous improvement is important, how do we know if we're improving? Again, we talk about being, understanding through measurement of a process. Well, but we also want to do that visually. So we have two ideas here, two values related to visual management. Genshi Genbatsu is one. That means going to the source. Going to the source. If there's a problem, not just taking someone else's word for it, but actually going to see it yourself. Walking there to that part of the process that perhaps you see there's an issue with, to collect data. Okay. We're not going to solve a problem by being hands-off, by sitting away from the problem. We got to see it. The next one is representing metrics pictorially. Showing data in an easily understandable way, in a chart, in a graph. This helps us process it. This helps us understand the phenomenon that we're seeing. This helps us to be able to improve something if we see that it needs to improve. We'll talk about some examples, by the way, of visual management here in a couple of seconds as well. But these are the values of an OE culture. Again, very much stemming from the assumptions of an OE culture that we already discussed. Now let's talk about artifacts of an OE culture. Some people that look at, you might read a lean book or a book on continuous improvement, and it can be challenging. So there's challenging vocabulary associated with some of this. In the program we have a Six Sigma course. And it's kind of related to OE, kind of related to continuous improvement, but that's about quality. But some folks are turned off by the focus on statistics in the Six Sigma. Really, the stuff is not that tough. You can put whatever, you can call these tools or ideas, whatever you want to label them, whatever works for your organization. But those are some artifacts. We talk about Genshi Genbatsu as one, an andon, a kanban. All these are terms that perhaps are unfamiliar to us if we have not been in an OE or continuous improvement type of an environment. But really, we can simplify that vocabulary that fits our context, that fits our culture. And that's a big thing. We're trying to implement OE in our context, in our culture. We want to do so in a way that makes sense for us. We can't just take another organization's tools, move them over to a different organization, throw them at our employees and see if they stick. It's not going to work because we haven't changed the assumptions and the values. So we need to do these three things all at the same time. Okay. But we also have a lot of tools. Artifacts of OE cultures are tools that help us to continuously improve. And there are a lot of different tools we could go through, but if we think about tools focused on problem solving, waste elimination and process improvement, and standardization, those are three areas that we can see artifacts, those representations of the values and the assumptions of OE culture that we already talked about. So let's talk about some of these tools. So problem-solving tools could include like doing the 5 whys or a fishbone diagram. Okay. The 5 whys, this is an example of a 5 whys worksheet. Here you define the problem, and in essence, very simple. We're walking through some very simple tools just today, very briefly. And again, in some of the other courses in the MSMOE program, you do so a lot more in depth. But it is what it sounds like. You're just asking why 5 times. The idea is you're trying to figure out the root cause here. You're trying to get to the root cause so you can solve that. So you define the problem. You might want to ask, why is this happening? Why is that? Why is that? Why is that? Why is that? And if the last answer is something you can't control, go back to the previous response. That's kind of how you know it's done. And so although we call it the 5 whys, you might not get to 5, you might get to 3, or you might get to 7. 5 is just sort of a rule of thumb. But it's the 5 whys to try and get us to get to the root cause of the problem so we can solve it. So we can solve that problem. With regard to problem solving, we also have the fishbone diagram. Kind of looks like the bones of a fish here, but we define the problem, and then we think about causes. We do some brainstorming, and we try and figure out causes of this problem. Here in this example, we're looking at big buckets of causes, big categories of causes that could be equipment related, process related, people related, materials, environment, management related, etc. Some folks say people, materials, machine. That's one way to look at it. There are a variety of different ways that you can parcel out the categories that could contribute to a problem. But the bottom line here is you brainstorm. Under these major categories you've identified, you come up with primary causes, secondary causes that might contribute to the problem. Well, how do you know what's causing this problem? One of the things we talked about is going and seeing. Actually going to that part of the process that's problematic. Going to see, visualize it. Collecting visual data. But it's about going to that source. Going to that place where the problem is occurring to try and solve it there, to try and see what's causing it. 2 simple problem-solving tools. Now we also have waste elimination and process improvement tools. Okay, so waste elimination and process improvement tools. 2 types of those. One would be value stream mapping, and another would be spaghetti diagrams. Here's a quick example of a value stream map. Basically what we're doing here is we're looking at a process. A process can be widely defined. It can be a process that touches on all parts of an organization, maybe even on customers and suppliers, or it can be a process within a smaller unit of an organization. But here what we're trying to do is we're trying to look at a process from point A to point B. All elements of that process need to be included, and we're tracking for time. Because what we're trying to do here is we're taking a look to see where our time is being spent. We know that time is a waste. We want to see if maybe there's a way that we can minimize some of the time that's being spent in certain areas, especially if that time is being spent in a way that's not value added. Okay, so here we're identifying those parts of a process that are value added, some that aren't value added perhaps, and we want to try and minimize the time that we're spending on those that are not value added. So for example, if we see inventory sitting somewhere for a long period of time, we know that inventory is a waste. We know that time is a waste. We want to try and remove that. Why is that inventory just sitting there? And this helps us to see that. This type of a chart helps us to see this because we're documenting the process from beginning to end. Here's a spaghetti diagram. Here's a spaghetti diagram of a facility. And what a spaghetti diagram does is it shows movement. And you can kind of see the strands here. The strands are where a person's moving to and from. And when we see a facility that has a lot of movement, as we're tracing worker movement, those lines start to look like a bowl of spaghetti. That's why it's called a spaghetti diagram. But one of the ways that we talk about is motion, movement. And so we want to try and minimize that movement. So here it looks like this worker is moving kind of all over the place. He's going to this station, over this station, back here, over here, back to this station. What this helps us to do is to visualize movement and to see, is there a way we can redesign this workspace perhaps in this example? Can we redesign this workspace so that this person's movement is more limited? Two very simple tools. Simple but complicated. Simple in theory, complicated to actually map out and do. But standardization is another area, another artifact area here. Standardization involves listing all elements of either a role, a job that someone's doing, or a process. We're documenting it. Every step, every step. And by the way, this works really well with that value stream map because we can take a look at that visual representation of a process in a value stream map and put this more textually, perhaps, in standard operating procedures. And so we determine times for each element. We always want to try and replicate that lowest time. If we can't replicate the lowest time as we're examining a process, we want to think, why can't we do that? We've gotten to this lowest time once, why can't we do this every time? There must be something going on here. There must be some variation here that we need to adjust for, or that we need to fix. We need to problem solve to always be able to replicate that lowest time. We also determine here through standardization if any major time is spent on non-productive elements. And so what we do is we redesign the process, we redesign the role. And again, this stuff isn't written in stone. We do this continuously. We're always trying to take out the waste. We're always trying to become more efficient, perhaps, more effective as well. We want to redesign. We want to emphasize our focus on productive tasks. We want to eliminate the waste and redundancies that we see in our standard operating procedures. And once we do that, that becomes the new standard. Those things become the new standard. So standardization is an important artifact of an OE culture. So that was a crash course in just some commonality that many OE or continuous improvement type cultures have as they relate to OE cultures. Again, every culture is a little bit different. Not every tool will work in all cultures, even if two organizations have cultures that are somewhat similar. They're OE oriented in nature. It doesn't necessarily mean that the same tool is going to work in both cultures. So you need to understand your culture as you're implementing these tools. So that said, how do we actually change a culture? Well, we're not going to create change in a culture unless if we're influential. Okay? So unless if we're influential. We need to build influence. We need to build influence in a culture, in an organization. You know, they say that there are, I guess, maybe 5 major ways that someone can be influential in an organization. One is that person has a formal title, and so they're influential because people report to them. They're a decision maker to an extent in that organization. Another, kind of related, is that person can provide rewards. Maybe that person sets salaries, wage increases, promotions. Another is sort of this idea of coercive influence, which is kind of the opposite of that. We can take something away, we can remove a budget. And so for those 3 things, someone can be influential in an organization. But there are other ways that someone can be influential in an organization as well. We also have expert influence. Expert influence. And by the way, this stuff that I'm talking about here when I'm talking about building influence is from French and Raven's famous research from about 6 decades ago, 7 decades ago. But that expert influence, that means someone's really proficient, really good at a task, at what they do. Okay? They're influential because people seek that person out, perhaps for training, for their perspective, but also influential because if that person leaves our organization, we can't function as well. But the last one is more that referent base of influence. Someone's likable. Someone's likable for some reason. It's more of an emotional connection with somebody. So these aren't the only ways to build influence, but these are 5 ways that people can build influence in an organization. And the idea here is that if you have multiple bases of influence, the more influential you're likely to be in an organization. Once you have that influence, you know, we're not going to become an operationally excellent organization on day 2. You know, so we put our minds to it, we've changed the assumptions, the values of our culture, and now we're there. We're always problem solving effectively, we're always minimizing waste, and we're always continuously improving. Not always going to happen, but we want to create small wins. You want to create small wins. You want to see that, you want to show that, okay, we've implemented this tool and this has helped us. Visual management comes into play there because we can actually visualize, see the data that shows us that we've improved in some way. So creating small wins helps with this snowball effect. We create the small wins, with the snowball at the top of the hill, we roll it down, it becomes a larger snowball. So the more small wins we can create, perhaps the more likely we are to continue continuous improvement initiatives. This is difficult to do in strong cultures. I talked about, how strong cultures can be a good thing because everyone, has the same mentality perhaps, everyone thinks, acts, behaves the same way, and so we don't have to spend a lot of time talking about, those assumptions. But also, if we all think, act, believe the same things, we never change. And so if we're trying to change into an OE culture, we're not going to always do so if we have a really strong culture already, especially if we're not going to tackle those assumptions of that strong culture. So that's the big thing here. The big takeaway is, and again, I can't say this enough, I've seen so many different failures in terms of trying to implement OE and continuous improvement initiatives in organizations. You can't just focus on those artifacts. You can't just throw the tools at your employees without changing the values, without changing the assumptions. Not going to happen. Sad thing is, maybe not sad thing, but the challenging thing is, changing the assumptions, because they're so deep rooted in an organization, it's very difficult to do. Changing the values of an organization, very difficult to do. This is the biggest challenge for OE implementation, trying to change that culture. That's the hardest thing that there is. But if we can change the culture, if we can change those assumptions and values, we'll go a long way then to actually being able to implement some effective OE tools. Okay. So more information, I'm always happy to connect with you a lot more. So if you want more information either about what we talked about today or about the MSMOE program, I'm happy to share that with you. We do have a pamphlet. I can share with you some readings in operational excellence here that I showed at the beginning of the session. I'd be happy to send that out to you as well. If you're interested in maybe joining us in the grad program here at St. Vincent, we have some application forms available on the website. Our website is stvincent.edu/MSMOE. I'm interested in talking with you about curriculum, my research, what we do in the program, what we talked about today. Feel free to give me an email, feel free to give me a call. My contact information is there. If you want to talk a little bit more about logistics in terms of how to apply to the program, financial aid, those sort of things, Amanda Gunther is the graduate coordinator for all the graduate programs at St. Vincent College. So her contact information is here. There's her email address and her phone number as well.